Chapter 2. The Earth Rebels Against Mythistory. The 1967 war opened fresh perspectives for Israeli archaeological research. It had hitherto been confined to digging within the Green Line boundaries, but now the conquest of the West Bank opened wide spaces with numerous sites waiting to be explored in the heart of biblical Judea and, of course, around Jerusalem. International law prohibited Israeli archaeologists from excavating in the occupied territories and carrying away the ancient findings, but this was the ancient homeland, and who would presume to object? At first, the euphoria of the victors in the war for the land blended with the jubilation of those digging under it. A large part of the Israeli intelligentsia had become addicted to the sweet dream of the great land of Israel. Among them were many archaeologists who thought that their finest hour had come. Once and for all, they would fuse the ancient nation with its historical homeland, thereby proving the truth of the text. But as their investigations progressed, the elation that had filled Aharoni and his colleagues began to wane. Excavations in the Central Highlands, Mount Manasseh and Mount Ephraim, around Jerusalem and Mount Judah, uncovered more and more finds that heightened concerns and questions that had arisen earlier in sites within the borders of the State of Israel. Biblical archaeology, which had been an enlisted instrument of the nationalist ideology from 1948 to 1967, began to show symptoms of unease. More than 20 years would pass before the first discoveries were placed before the general public and the first cracks appeared in the consensus of the dominant scholarly culture. For this to happen, several developments had to take place both in the methods of exploring the past and in the national mood within Israel. Significant changes occurred in the profession of history during the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, which affected the work of archaeologists the world over and eventually also in Israel. The decline of classical political historiography and the rise of social, and later anthropological, historical research led a good many archaeologists to consider other strata of ancient civilizations. Everyday material existence, the ancient world of labor, nutrition and burial, basic cultural practices, became increasingly the main objects of international research. The concept of longue durée, product of the French annales historiography, especially suited the excavators, who happily adopted this approach, which tracks long processes. Echoes of this historical transition eventually reached the Israeli academic world, which, since biblical archaeology was essentially event-oriented and political, found its predominance gradually slipping. Young archaeologists began to have misgivings and escaped to earlier eras. More researchers encountered unresolved contradictions. But it was only after the outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987, and the advent of greater critical openness in the Israeli public arena, that the excavators began to speak up, their voices hoarse from having so long been muffled by sacred soil. The first to feel the tremor was the time of the patriarchs. The period that had been so dear to the hearts of Dubnoff, Baron and all the Zionist historians bristled with unanswered questions. Did Abraham migrate to Canaan in the 21st or the 20th century BCE? The nationalist historians had of course assumed that the Bible exaggerated the astonishing longevity of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the crucial migration from Mesopotamia led by the father of the Jewish people was associated with the promise that his offspring would inherit the land of Canaan, hence the obvious desire to preserve the historical heart of the first immigration to the land of Israel. Already toward the end of the 1960s, Mazar, one of the fathers of nationalist archaeology, encountered a difficulty that left him troubled. The stories of the patriarchs mention Philistines, Arameans, and a great many camels. Yet all the archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicated that the Philistines appeared in the region no earlier than the 12th century BCE. The Arameans, who play a significant role in the book of Genesis, first appeared in Near Eastern inscriptions from the 11th century, and become a notable presence from the 9th onward. The camels, too, gave no end of trouble. They were first domesticated at the start of the first millennium BCE, and as beasts of burden in commercial activity from the 8th century BCE. To preserve the historicity of the Bible, Mazar was obliged to sacrifice his original chronology and push the stories of the patriarchs to a later period, concluding that they generally fitted the closing of the time of Judges or the early monarchy. Other, non-Israeli scholars, notably the bold American Thomas L. Thompson, had realized some time before that the old dating was illogical, as was the shaky chronology proposed earlier by Albright and his followers. Instead, they suggested treating the story cycle of the patriarchs as a collection of late literary creations composed by gifted theologians. This meant that the detailed plots, the references to locations and the names of nearby tribes and peoples did not indicate a misty popular myth that had multiplied and improved over time, but rather a conscious ideological composition made hundreds of years later. Many of the names mentioned in the book of Genesis appeared in the 7th or even the 6th century BCE. The authors of this book were undoubtedly familiar with the kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia, which of course arose long after the hypothetical first migration in the 20th century BCE. The late authors of the Pentateuch wanted to emphasize the different, non-local origin of their imaginary forefathers. They were not like modern patriots, rooted in the national land and confident that they had sprung from its soil. They were more concerned to claim a higher cultural lineage than national proprietary rights over the country. That was why the exalted forefather of the nation originated in Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia, and when his circumcised son Isaac came of age, Abraham would not consider marrying him to a local pagan Canaanite girl. Hence a special messenger was dispatched to bring him a kosher bride from Nahor, a city that was not more monotheistic than Hebron but was, in the Babylonian world of the 6th or 5th century BCE, regarded as more illustrious than the little city of the patriarchs in Canaan. By contrast, was the center of a well-known, respected culture, if not the New York, at any rate the Paris of the ancient Near East. The Chaldeans began to settle there in the 9th century, and the Chaldean king Nabonidus developed it as a major religious center only in the 6th century BCE. Was it fortuitous that the anonymous, and probably quite late, authors originated from the same place? A similar search for a lineage from a great cultural center animated the story of the emergence from Egypt, the second significant myth to be shaken. The fragility of this story had been known for some time, but the centrality of the Exodus in the very definition of Jewish identity, not to mention the role of the Passover festival in its culture, made for a stubborn refusal to examine it. We have seen that Dubnoff was uneasy about the Meneptos stela of the late 13th century BCE. Its Pharaonic inscription declares that, among the various cities and tribes that had been subdued, Israel was destroyed and has no more seed. This could have been Pharaonic hyperbole, but it certainly suggests that there was some small cultural entity named Israel, among other small groups, in Egyptian-ruled Canaan. In the 13th century BCE, the purported time of the Exodus, Canaan was ruled by the still powerful pharaohs. This means that Moses led the freed slaves out of Egypt. To Egypt. According to the biblical narrative, the people he led through the wilderness for 40 years included 600,000 warriors. They would have been traveling with their wives and children, implying a party of around 3 million in total. Aside from the fact that it was utterly impossible for a population of such size to wander through the desert for so long, an event of such magnitude should have left some epigraphic or archaeological traces. The ancient Egyptians kept meticulous records of every event, and there is a great deal of documentation about the kingdom's political and military life. There are even documents about incursions of nomadic groups into the realm. Yet there is not a single mention of any children of Israel who lived in Egypt, or rebelled against it, or emigrated from it at any time. Pithom, mentioned in the biblical story, does in fact appear in an early external source, but it was built as an important city only at the end of the 6th century BCE. No traces have been found in the Sinai desert of any significant movement of population through it during the said period, and the location of the famous biblical Mount Sinai has yet to be discovered. Etzion Geber and Arad, mentioned in the story of the wanderings, did not exist in that period, and appear much later as permanent, flourishing settlements. After 40 years of wandering, the children of Israel arrived in Canaan, and took it by storm. Following the divine command, they annihilated most of the local population and forced the remainder to serve them as hewers of wood and drawers of water. After the conquest, the people that had been united under Moses, split up into separate tribes, like the late Greek settlement in 12 city-states, and divided the territorial booty among them. This ruthless myth of settlement, described in the book of Joshua in colorful detail as one of the earliest genocides, never actually happened. The famous conquest of Canaan was the next myth to fall apart in the skirmishes of the new archaeology. For a long time the Zionist historians, followed by the Israeli archaeologists, ignored well-known findings. If at the time of the supposed Israelite conquest the country was ruled by Egypt, how was it that not a single Egyptian document mentioned this? Moreover, why does the Bible make no mention of the Egyptian presence in the country? Archaeological excavations in Gaza and Beth Shean had long revealed the Egyptian presence at the time of the supposed conquest and after, but the ancient national text was too precious to forswear, and so the scholars learned to muffle these feisty little facts with evasive and vague explanations. New excavations at Jericho, Ai, and Heshbon, those powerful walled cities which the children of Israel supposedly captured with fanfare, confirmed the old findings. In the late 13th century BCE Jericho was an insignificant little town, certainly unwalled, and neither Ai nor Heshbon had yet been settled at all. The same holds for most of the other cities mentioned in the story of the conquest. Traces of destruction and fire have been found in Hazor, Lachish, and Megiddo, but the collapse of these old Canaanite cities was a slow process that took about a century and was very likely caused by the arrival of the sea peoples, such as the Philistines, who at that time invaded the entire eastern littoral of the Mediterranean, as attested by a wealth of Egyptian and other documentation. The new Israeli archaeologists and scholars concerned themselves less with event-oriented political exploration and more with social anthropological investigation, conducting regional surveys and exploring ancient living conditions, means of production, and cult practices over large areas, and they made a number of discoveries and new working hypotheses regarding colonization in the highlands of Canaan. In the lowlands, after the decline of the Canaanite cities, the settlement on land was probably carried out by local nomads who gradually, and with many interim phases, formed sedentary agricultural communities. The starting population from which the kingdoms of Israel and Judah would gradually arise was probably autochthonous Canaanite, which slowly emerged from under the Egyptian overlords as they withdrew from the country between the 12th and 10th centuries BCE. The pottery and working tools of these new peasants did not differ from those of other Canaanites except for one cultural feature, the absence of pig bones from their settlements. This is a significant fact, but it indicates neither the conquest of Canaan by an alien ethnos nor that these farmers were monotheists. The development from scattered communities of cultivators to the rise of cities based on their produce was a long and extremely gradual process that culminated in the emergence of two small local kingdoms. The next biblical story to lose its scientific historicity as a result of new archaeological discoveries was the jewel in the crown of the long national memory. Ever since Greats, through D. Nur and the Israeli historians who followed, the United National Kingdom of David and Solomon was the glorious golden age in Jewish history. All the future political models fed on this paragon of the biblical past and drew from it imagery, thinking and intellectual exhilaration. New novels embedded it in their plots, poems and plays were composed about the towering Saul, the fearless David and the wise Solomon. Excavators discovered the remains of their palaces, and detailed maps completed the historical picture and outlined the boundaries of the United Empire that spread from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. Then came the post-1967 archaeologists and Bible scholars, who began to cast doubt on the very existence of this mighty kingdom, which, according to the Bible, grew rapidly after the period of the Judges. Excavations in Jerusalem in the 1970s, that is, after the city had been reunified forever by the Israeli government, undermined the fantasies about the glorious past. It was not possible to dig under the Haram al-Sharif, but explorations at all the other sites that were opened up around it failed to find any traces of an important 10th century kingdom, the presumed time of David and Solomon. No vestige was ever found of monumental structures, walls or grand palaces, and the pottery found there was scanty and quite simple. At first it was argued that the unbroken occupation of the city and the massive construction in the reign of Herod had destroyed the remains, but this reasoning fell flat when impressive traces were uncovered from earlier periods in Jerusalem's history. Other supposed remains from the United Kingdom also came to be questioned. The Bible describes Solomon's rebuilding of the northern cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, and Yigel-Yadin located in the grand structures of Hazor, the city of Solomon the Wise. He also found palaces from the time of the United Kingdom in Megiddo, and discovered the famous Solomonic gates in all three ancient cities. Unfortunately, the building style of these gates was found to be later than the 10th century BCE, they greatly resembled vestiges of a palace built in Samaria in the 9th. The technological development of the carbon-14 test confirmed that the colossal structures in the area dated not from Solomon's reign but from the time of the northern kingdom of Israel. Indeed, no trace has been found of the existence of that legendary king, whose wealth is described in the Bible as almost matching that of the mighty imperial rulers of Babylonia or Persia. The inescapable and troublesome conclusion was that if there was a political entity in 10th century Judea, it was a small tribal kingdom, and that Jerusalem was a fortified stronghold. It is possible that the tiny kingdom was ruled by a dynasty known as the House of David. An inscription discovered in Tel Dan in 1993 supports this assumption, but this kingdom of Judah was greatly inferior to the kingdom of Israel to its north, and apparently far less developed. The documents from El Amarna, dating from the 14th century BCE, indicate that already there were two small city-states in the highlands of Canaan, Shechem, and Jerusalem, and the Mena Postila shows that an entity named Israel existed in northern Canaan at the end of the 13th century BCE. The plentiful archaeological finds unearthed in the West Bank during the 1980s reveal the material and social difference between the two mountain regions. Agriculture thrived in the fertile north, supporting dozens of settlements, whereas in the south there were only some 20 small villages in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. The Kingdom of Israel was already a stable and strong state in the 9th century, while the Kingdom of Judah consolidated and grew strong only by the late 8th. There were always in Canaan two distinct, rival political entities, though they were culturally and linguistically related. Variants of ancient Hebrew were spoken by the inhabitants of both. The Kingdom of Israel under the Omride dynasty was clearly greater than the Kingdom of Judah under the House of David. It is about the former that we have the oldest extra-biblical evidence, the inscription on the so-called Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III of Assyria, the famous Mesha Stela, and the inscription found at Tel Dan. All the grand structures previously attributed to Solomon were in fact later projects of the Kingdom of Israel. At its zenith, it was one of the most populated and prosperous kingdoms in the territory between Damascus in the north, Moab in the east, the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and the Kingdom of Judah in the south. Archaeological excavations in various locations have also shown that the inhabitants of the mountainous northern region were, like the peasants in Judah, devout polytheists. They worshipped the popular Yahweh, who gradually became, like the Greek Zeus and the Roman Jupiter, the central deity, but they did not forsake the cults of other deities, such as Baal, Shemesh and the beautiful Asherah. The authors of the Pentateuch, who were late Judean monotheists, detested the rulers of Israel but were no less envious of their legendary power and glory. They expropriated their prestigious name Israel, which was probably well established, while never desisting from the denunciation of their moral and religious transgressions. The great sin of the people and rulers of Israel was, of course, the fact that their kingdom was defeated by the Assyrian Empire in the second half of the 8th century BCE, that is, a good while before the fall of Judah in the 6th. Moreover, they left no agents of divine remembrance to clothe their ardent religion in attractive pseudo-historical garments. The conclusion accepted by a majority of the new archaeologists and Bible scholars was that there never was a great united monarchy, and that King Solomon never had grand palaces in which he housed his 700 wives and 300 concubines. The fact that the Bible does not name this large empire strengthens this conclusion. It was late writers who invented and glorified a mighty united kingdom, established by the grace of the single deity. Their rich and distinctive imagination also produced the famous stories about the creation of the world, and the terrible flood, the wanderings of the forefathers and Jacob's struggle with the angel, the exodus from Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea, the conquest of Canaan and the miraculous stopping of the sun in Gibeon. The central myths about the primeval origin of a marvelous nation that emerged from the desert, conquered a spacious land and built a glorious kingdom, were a boon for rising Jewish nationalism and Zionist colonization. For a century they provided textual fuel of canonical quality that energized a complex politics of identity and territorial expansion demanding self-justification and considerable sacrifice. Troublesome archaeologists and Bible scholars, in Israel and abroad, undermined these myths, which by the end of the 20th century seemed about to be relegated to the status of fiction, with an unbridgeable gulf gaping between them and real history. But although Israeli society was no longer so engaged, and no longer so in need of the historical legitimation that had supported its creation and its very existence, it still had difficulty accepting the new findings, and the public obstinately resisted the change in the direction of research.